During the High Republic era, the Jedi Order, ideologically speaking, had reached the peak of its ambition, and some might say arrogance. Jedi numbers were at an all-time high, and Chancellor Lina So's Outer Rim development projects gave the Jedi plenty of new missions in the sparsely populated Outer Rim territories of the Republic, where law and stability were not a common sight. Now, during this period, the Jedi were pretty much unified as a group, unlike during the Clone Wars period or other periods of turmoil and strife. And so the Jedi treated their job with quite a lot of responsibility, and they considered taking a life to be a very serious matter during this period. The main starfighter being utilized by the Jedi at the time were the Vectors. This was from Valkyrie Enterprise. Like most Jedi starfighters throughout history, these starfighters were extremely maneuverable and fast and had very few flight aids on board. The idea was to allow the ship to become an extension of the Jedi and their force. In order to use the weapon system on the Vector, which were just a pair of laser cannons, you actually had to install your lightsaber into a socket on the dash. This was, I guess, to prevent theft and also make the Jedi think a little bit more before they actually opened fire with their weapon. Once the weapon was secure, the cockpit would also light up the same color as the saber, further emphasizing the deadly choice they were about to make. So the Jedi Vector Starfighter is actually based on some original concept art from Episode 3 of the V19 Torrent Starfighter, in case you notice any resemblance here. The Vector came with a single or double seat configuration. A free trade zone and a few intergalactic conflicts later, the Jedi Order was a completely different organization. Gone were these special starfighters with their lightsaber-locked weapons and this contemplation about taking a life. Because who needs that when you can create a dedicated Jedi tactical bomber, otherwise known as the Jedi Bomber? This essentially was a Delta 7B Ether Sprite class light interceptor, the second variant of the Delta 7, which had a thicker hull and a socket for astromechs. The Jedi Bomber was designed with a bombardier seat that was placed behind the pilot, along with munition launchers on the wingtips. Peace and love is all great on paper or in doctrine and dogma, but when the bullets start fighting, not even the Jedi Order is above the arms race that usually comes. Before we continue, a word from our sponsor for today's video, Ownersaber.com. Once again, we have the Cypher Blade. This is one of the cheaper, more simply designed and lighter blades offered by this company. And that's because this thing is actually a dueling saber. It's pretty well balanced and you can whack it pretty hard and it won't break. And if you take a closer look, it gives off a very Sith vibe with its sleek black handle and claw-like guards which surround the emitter assembly. The Cypher Blade also has many of the same features that their premium Xenopixel line has, like customized color, sound effects, and different types of blade modes. From now until March 11th, the Cypher Blade will be available for purchase for 30% off. With our discount code MEOW, that's all caps, you'll get an additional 10% off. For more information, please check out the link down below. Thank you for your patience. Back to the videos. The Rho-1 Limulus class courier from Quad Systems Engineering is a mashup between the ETA class shuttle and the Delta 7 Ether Sprite Light Interceptor. The ship tried to accomplish the speed of an interceptor, and it also had a decent amount of storage for a ship of its size, which is why the ship is classified as a courier and not as a starfighter or interceptor. The ship was easily recognizable by its half-moon space frame, and it was mainly used by the Jedi Order for diplomatic missions. Despite being a military ship, the Rho-1 lacked much armor and shields and only had 2 light laser cannons. The Rho-class transport, not to be confused with the Rho-1 that we just talked about, was classified as a shuttle. The ship, which had 6 laser cannons on board, was designed to transport either cargo or passengers through contested war zones. The ship had magnetic clamps which could be used to attach and detach cargo modules. This allowed crews to prepare containers for transport before the Rho-class even arrived. The Rho-class was mainly used by Republic medical stations or logistics services. Even though it was armed, there were more heavily armored and shielded vessels in the Republic that were used as dropships for frontline troops. The Rho-class transport had a hyperdrive, which meant that it could operate independently from a carrier, unlike the LAAT gunship series. Now, In the very beginning, Incom Corporations was mostly known for designing repulsor lifts, and so with their first few starfighter designs, they actually enlisted the help of another corporation known as Subpro Corporation. They had a little bit more experience designing starfighters. The PTB-625 Planetary Bomber was a joint venture starship by both companies. This ship featured a narrow space frame similar to the one that was found on the ARC-170, but was much larger in size. The ship had a bomb bay which was used to drop heavy munitions from orbit. The PTB-625 was mainly used to rain punishment down onto planetary defenses and was mainly used in the Outer Rim during the Clone Wars by the Galactic Republic Navy. The NTB-630 Naval Bomber was another Incom Corporation, Subpro Corporation joint venture. It has very similar design cues and aesthetics to the ARC-170 and the previous planetary bomber we just talked about. However, the Naval Bomber was more heavily armored and shielded than the ARC-170, but at the same time it was a lot more maneuverable and faster than the PTB-625. It was kind of a mid-range type of starfighter that was designed specifically to target capital ships. Now, because of the Rusan Reformation and the disarmament of the Federal Navy, there were just not many options. Now, because of the Rusan Reformation and the disarmament of the Federal Navy, there aren't that many options for starfighters during the Galactic Republic period, so we're going to be taking a look at some gunships, some patrol boats, and some slightly larger vessels as well, like this one, the PB950 patrol boat. From its boxy nature, you could probably tell that this was a Corellian Engineering Corporation product. At just 37 meters in length, this was a military ship designed for customs officers and systems patrol fleets. It had a crew of 4, which included 2 pilots and 2 gunners, along with 8 enforcement agents in the back. The ship was also equipped with 2 medium-ion cannons for non-lethal disabling of ships, along with a quad laser cannon turret and a concussion missile turret. The PB950 had a double-hull design, which made it very, very durable, and it would be used by the Galactic Republic and also planetary defense forces all throughout the Clone Wars. The new Klez attack transport was very similar in appearance to the Rogue class transport, except for those detachable cargo modules. Instead, the new Klez had a passenger compartment designed to ferry a small platoon directly to the front lines of a battle. The new class was supposed to supplement the beloved LAAT during an invasion, but there were some pretty large differences. The LAAT performed much better as a gunship because it had much heavier weapons. This included a belt-fed missile launcher system, along with gunners who could operate laser beam turrets. The new class attacks transport was manufactured by Cygnus Spaceworks. You might be familiar with this if you saw our last video about lesser-known Imperial starfighters. Cygnus Spaceworks would eventually roll out the Lambda-class shuttle, which was heavily based on their experiences with the new class and Rogue class shuttles. At the beginning of the Clone Wars, the Galactic Republic Navy, like everything else in the Republic military, was in complete chaos and scrambling to get things into operational mode. The main starfighter utilized by the Republic at the time was the V19 Torrent Starfighter and the Cord-class Starfighter. The Cord-class Starfighter was a light interceptor that was armed with only one single laser cannon. These ships would commonly be found on the Acclamator-class assault ship. These ships would usually be stationed on the Acclamator-class assault ship. I guess they're better than nothing. Lastly, we have the T6 Shuttle, or the Jedi T6 Shuttle. This was an older designed ship which was used as a transport by the Jedi Order. The ship was supposedly protected by the Galactic Republic's universal sign for diplomatic vessels, which was just basically red paint. Also had ejector seats and survival capsules on board in case anything went wrong. The cockpit of the ship would be repurposed as the cockpit for the ASF-01 B-Wing Starfighter used by the Rebel Alliance. Now in this video we'll be taking a look at the Galactic Republic during its more peaceful time. That's between the Rusan Reformation to the Clone Wars. This is when the Galactic Republic lost the will to kill Xenos and, swim in their green blood. What makes this period of Republic history so strange is the fact that the Galactic Republic lacked a federal military for over 1,000 years. And then in the last half a decade of the Galactic Republic's rule, there was a massive shift and militarization effort by the central government thanks to the discovery of the separate destroyed army. And so during that period in Galactic Republic history, you'll actually see a lot of civilian ships being hastily upgraded and fortified to fit military service. This includes the first ship we'll be talking about today, the Cs1 Star Shuttle. This Corellian Engineering Corporation designed ship was a civilian transport commonly used all across the galaxy before the outbreak of the war. It could hold up to 200 individuals on board and had a Class 1.5 hyperdrive and a relatively thick and armored hull for a civilian ship. It was only natural then this ship would be used as a military transport as well. It was sort of like the Douglas C-47 in our own world, which dropped Pathfinders the night before D-Day in Normandy, but at the same time was known by the civilian world as the DC-3, a very popular civilian airliner used by industry leaders TWA and Pan Am. Now the Cs1 Star Shuttle wouldn't just be used as a military transport. During the Stark Hyperspace War, Senator Ranulph Tarkin of Iradu, a rabid supporter of creating a standing federal military, of course it's a Tarkin, modifies a Cs1 starship into an assault cruiser and calls it the Invincible. On top of adding shields, armor, sensors, and weapons to the Cs1, Tarkin also added evac pods to carry troops. The Invincible would lead a fleet of Consular-class space cruisers against the Stark Combine, a bunch of pirates and thugs. But Ranulph, just like his nephew Wilhelm, would ultimately fail in his goal and be consumed by the chaos that he stirred up. The Citadel-class civilian cruiser from Connoisseur was designed in the latter years of the Galactic Republic during a time in which hostility and separatism were on the rise in the Outer Rim. As order broke down outside the core region, private citizens of the Republic became more and more worried about their well-being. The lack of a large police presence or a standing federal military meant that private citizens were really beginning to worry about their private safety when they were traveling in more sparsely populated areas of the galaxy. The Citadel-class civilian cruiser was marketed directly to these individuals who might have enough credits to purchase their own custom civilian cruiser, which honestly was just a heavily armored and armed shuttle, not all that different in specs and equipment from a Lambda-class shuttle from the Imperial era. The Citadel class not only had shields, a tractor beam, ion cannons, and laser cannons, it even had a concussion missile launcher, which definitely does not seem defensive in nature like it says on the brochure. These ships would not only be popular amongst rich businessmen and celebrities, it would also be used by high-ranking military officials, and eventually it would be adopted by the Republic Navy. The Citadel-class civilian cruiser was so tough and durable that even destroyed versions of the ship were salvaged and usually rebuilt. Officially speaking, the Manator class was the first ship to receive the classification of Dreadnought from the Anaxis War College. This massive 8,000-meter long ship was a sign of things to come. The Rusan Reformation had been signed almost 1,000 years earlier, and although regulations from the Reformation still limited the size and amount of weapons the Manator-class Star Dreadnought could have on board, this clearly was not a ship designed for peace or defense, and it really did stretch the existing shipyard's technology and resources to actually accomplish the construction of such a large vessel. The orbital shipyard around Quant was probably one of the few places in the galaxy that could accommodate the construction of such a large ship. By the time the Clone Wars started, there were 7 of these Manator-class Star Dreadnoughts floating around in the core of the galaxy. The High Republic was a period of time that occurred roughly around 200 years before the Clone Wars started. It represented a time when belief in the central government and Jedi Order were at an all-time high, and massive government programs, which unfortunately one day would fail, were trying to tackle the wild instability in the Outer Rim and replace it with prosperity and commerce instead. The Jedi at the time utilized a few different ships for their operations. One of them was the Longbeam. This was a multi-purpose craft with some combat abilities, but was mostly used for search and rescue and transportation. The Longbeam was easily recognizable by its large, forward-positioned stabilizer fin. The Longbeam would play an integral part in saving lives during the Great Disaster, in which a gigantic starship breaks apart in hyperspace and then reappears randomly in real space and starts slamming into moons and space stations. The Longbeam was able to use its tractor beam and missiles to prevent the destruction of human and, I guess, other alien life. And so the Longbeam is essentially the real-life equivalent of a AAA tow truck, but with a 50 cal machine gun mounted onto it in case you run into bandits, hazardous wildlife, or, I don't know, Philly sports fans. The experimental IPV-2C stealth corvette was developed by Senior Design Systems. It was a prototype vessel that housed 28 extremely advanced and expensive cloaking devices that hid the ship not only from sensors but also the naked eye. The cloaking tech would work well and was tested during the Battle of Christophsis. It allowed the small stealth corvette to get within firing range of a Separatist command ship, the Invincible. But unfortunately, the cloak needed to be dropped in order for the stealth ship to launch its munitions. This is actually when the stealth corvette becomes really vulnerable to enemy fire. Also, once an enemy finds a stealth ship for the first time, they can track their magnetic signature. Overall, the stealth corvette worked quite well, but its limitations and perhaps more importantly its price made mass production and implementation of this vessel within the Galactic Republic unlikely. At the onset of the Clone Wars, the Maelstrom-class battlecruiser was the largest ship in the Galactic Republic fleet. This massive Delta-shaped command ship utilized 20 heavy turbo laser batteries, 30 ion cannons, and 40 missile launchers to command the battlefield. The Maelstrom could also carry over 100 starfighters and support ships on board. Yet you've probably never seen this vessel or even have heard of it, and that's because it was deemed to be far too expensive to actually operate, which is why very few of these ships saw any combat during the Clone Wars. The Empire's entire line of starships finds its roots in ancient Sith designs and also the Galactic Republic's need of new warships. We already covered the Victory-class Star Destroyer in our video on lesser-known Imperial ships. It was introduced in the late Clone Wars period, but mainly used by the Empire. Today we'll be taking a look at a different ship from the same era, the Tector-class Star Destroyer. This 1,600-meter long ship was almost identical in shape and design to the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, but a sharp-eyed ship enthusiast will be able to spot the difference. You see, the Tector class does not have ventral hangars. These are seen as a weakness by designers and featured heavily armored coverings over them instead. At the time, the Tector was designed specifically for broadside exchanges with other battleships, so any kind of opening or hangar was seen as a structural weakness. The Tector class actually had 0 starfighters on board despite being more than a mile long, which if you ask me is kind of stupid. Now you might be thinking to yourself, this ship doesn't really make any sense, and you're actually right, because the real reason why this ship was created was because of you sharp-eyed fans. In Episode 6, during the Battle of Endor, the Millennium Falcon flies beneath an Imperial-class Star Destroyer that didn't have 2 ventral hangars. This most likely was just an oversight by the production team, but they retconned it and made this mistake into the Tector-class Star Destroyer. The Gx1 Short Hauler, or a Lantillian shuttle, was a small 37.28-meter long ship that was primarily used as a star bus to ferry commuters on short journeys. It was equipped with a Class 2 hyperdrive and had up to a month's worth of consumables on board. The Republic would adopt these ships for diplomatic missions and mount the Gx1 Short Hauler with a turret-mounted double laser cannon, an upgraded sensor suite, and communication array. Even with these upgrades and its relatively robust construction, the Gx1 Short Hauler was not really designed to go up against enemy military ships and needed an escort in some situations. The ship also had an overly complicated landing gear mechanism that did jam frequently. When I say A-Series Interceptor from Quant Systems Engineering, you're probably immediately going to think about the RZ-1A wing. Or if you've watched our recent episode about the longest serving ships in the galaxy, you might be thinking about the R-Class Tactical Strike Fighter. This is an even safer bet because it was used by the Republic Navy for 4,000 straight years. But there's actually another line of A-Series, and at one point in time, they were going to be the mainline starfighter for the Empire, not Senior Fleet Systems' more dramatic-looking TIE Fighter line. Now, the A-Series was pretty generic. It was essentially just a pod for a cockpit with 2 pylons with engines attached onto them. During the Stark Hyperspace War, decades before the Clone Wars had started, these ships were quite popular amongst planetary defense forces. They're actually pretty bare bones when it came to armor and weapons, and they lacked the hyperdrive and were pretty much carrier or planet-side based. But they were also dirt cheap and performed well enough that even Jedi would occasionally pilot them. Quad-drive yards would eventually update the H6 into the A7 Hunter. It still had no hyperdrive, no shields, minimal support systems, and only 2 laser cannons. And while it was faster and more agile than the TIE Fighter, it was also relatively more expensive than the easier to produce TIE line. Although the A7 Hunter would eventually be rejected for mass production, many Imperial officers did buy these ships specifically for their own capital ships. Cygnus Spaceworks might not be a manufacturer you're familiar with, but you're definitely familiar with some of their products, like the Lambda-class shuttle and also the ETA-class shuttle. As you can tell, this company has a preference for tri-wing designs, and so the Alpha-class XG1 Starwing, the company's first and only starfighter, also sports this design with an additional 2 folding wings to increase maneuverability and control in atmosphere. The Starwing was far more maneuverable and a lot faster than anything else Cygnus Spaceworks had developed at this point. The ship had 2 laser cannons and 2 ion cannons above the cockpit, and then 2 concussion missile launchers or proton torpedo launchers on the sides of the cockpit. Cygnus Spaceworks made the Starwing a bit bigger than your traditional starfighter, and so unlike the TIE Fighter, it had robust shields and a hyperdrive, making this ship a perfect response to the Rebellion's fast-moving snub fighters, which oftentimes vanished into hyperspace after launching their raids. However, the Starwing lacked the maneuverability to engage smaller starfighters in dogfights like the X-Wing and A-Wing. It would suffer similar issues that the ARC-170 would have during the Clone Wars against the droid fighters. The Starwing was essentially a stopgap measure for the Empire as they rushed to create more advanced versions of the TIE Fighter like the TIE Defender and the TIE Avenger. When the Galactic Empire began nationalizing shipyards, Income Corporation, creators of the Z95 Headhunter and the ARC-170 Starfighter, were also swept up in Palpatine's effort to create a massive and cheap military through economy of scale. At the time, Income's premier design and engineering team was working on the prototype of what would become the T65 X-Wing. Unfortunately, most talented thinkers are going to be independent-minded, and of course, these designers and engineers would defect from the Empire and give the X-Wing to the Rebellion. Which is kind of a good thing for the X-Wing because although it was superior in many ways to the basic TIE Fighter, it would have never won a contract over the much smaller and cheaper platform. The defection of the X-Wing team would have been pretty awkward for those who decided to stay in Income Corporation and remain loyal to the Empire. Income engineer Joe Isley would go on to create Income's first starfighter for the Empire, and that was the I-7 HAL Runner, after watching a pack of HAL Runners from the planet of Kamar relentlessly chase and attack their prey. These things looked terrifying. The I-7 HAL Runner was designed around a very aerodynamic fixed-wing structure, making it terrific for atmospheric flight, because it actually had maneuvering flaps on its control surfaces. The ship was lightly equipped and a bit better in performance than the standard TIE Fighter. It also had the added benefit of having deflector shields. But its twin laser cannons were pretty weak, and the fighter's rudimentary targeting system was a problem as well. Ultimately, because that Income team defected to the Galactic Empire, most of the political and military elites in the galaxy hated Income Corporation. However, the I-7 HAL Runner was used in smaller, older fleets stationed in the Outer Rim. By this point, you've probably figured out that the Empire really likes things with alpha in its label, just like any individual who lacks self-confidence and needs to label everything around himself so that he can kind of understand what his role in the world is. Or something, I don't know. The Alpha 3 Nimbus class V-Wing from Quad Systems Engineering was introduced in the last year of the war as a replacement for the V19 Torrent Starfighter. It was created at a time when the Republic was seriously reconsidering their starfighter doctrine after the disastrous loss of the majority of the ARC-170s deployed during the Battle of Coruscant. Civilian and military officials within the Republic were calling for smaller ships with smaller crews that were much more maneuverable and able to outturn a droid fighter, which was kind of impossible. The Alpha 3 Nimbus class V-Wing's hull was similar to other interceptors from Quat Drive Yards. It was wedge-shaped and extremely thin, trading speed and less weight for protection. In many ways, the ship was quite similar to the Delta 7 Ether Sprite Light interceptor made by Quat for the Jedi. What made the V-Wing more easy to identify was its vertical stacked twin-ion engines. It also lacked a pressurized cockpit, large munitions, and hyperdrive to save weight. This made for an extremely agile and fast ship. It also had side-mounted S-foils to keep its robust reactor cool. Overall, the V-Wing was a pretty well-designed light interceptor, better than anything else the Republic had at the time. But the problem was, with the rise of the Empire, the V-Wing no longer had an enemy to fight. And because of its high cost, the V-Wing, like many other starfighters, was mostly rejected by the Empire. Someone keeps asking me in the comment section below to review some Imperial gunships, and so without further ado, today we'll be taking a look at the GAT-12 Skip Ray blast boat. Now, the blast boat designation only exists in Star Wars, and it basically means gunship. We're talking about something smaller than a Corvette, but with a similar amount of weaponry, but larger than a Starfighter, but with a similar amount of maneuverability. Essentially, these ships are a freak of nature, like most athletic tight ends in the NFL. The GAT-12 Skip Ray blast boat was from Senior Fleet Systems, and at least in the beginning of the war, this 25-meter long vessel was the smallest ship in the Imperial fleet, equipped with a hyperdrive. The blast boat had plenty of weapons, as its name would suggest. This includes 2 missile launchers, laser cannon turrets, ion cannons, along with a tractor beam. The GAT-12, however, did not fit in well with the Imperial Navy's new starfighter strategy, which involved a large amount of cheaply produced, non-hyperdrive equipped starfighters. Built by Quad-Drive Yards, the Bt49 Decimator looks quite similar to the TIE Reaper in looks and function. It's what you would call a prestige starship. By that I mean it was a very well-built and fully equipped transport/gunship. This 38-meter long ship was equipped with a Class 1 hyperdrive and had 2 quad laser cannons along with twin concussion missile launchers. It was mainly used as a reconnaissance unit or a picket ship. For career officers, commanding a Decimator meant that you're most likely going to be posted in the Outer Rim and going up against bandits and pirates, and during times of peace, this was a great way to get a promotion and get closer to commanding a capital ship. Of course, we can't talk about Imperial Starfighters without dipping into the TIE Fighter line, but most of you know almost every TIE Fighter out there, but did you know about the TIE CA Punisher Starfighter? Otherwise known as the TIE Capital Assault, this was a heavy bomber variant of the TIE Bomber. Instead of just having 1 weapons pod, the TIE CA had 4, which means 4 times the firepower, which is kind of ridiculous if you think about it. The TIE CA Punisher was designed to tackle fortifications, enemy starships, and ground forces. By the way, when they say bomber in Star Wars, they usually don't mean like dumb bombs. Instead, they're talking about concussion missiles and proton torpedoes as far as ordnance goes, and not whatever this nonsense is. For all you Rebels fans out there, you're probably familiar with Grand Admiral Thrawn's TIE Defender program, and one of the few Imperial snowfighters that truly had space superiority over the Rebel Alliance Starfighter Corps. But have you ever heard of the TIE PH Phantom? This was a similar tri-wing TIE fighter concept that stemmed from the failed V-38 assault fighter prototype. But what made the TIE Phantom so special was the fact that it was carrying an extremely advanced prototype cloaking device using Stygium crystals, which essentially could warp light to make things invisible to the naked eye. This is what Starkiller had on his ship, the Rogue Shadow. Since all Starfighter dogfights take place within line of sight, this would be a huge advantage for Imperial pilots to have. This ship was also unusually well equipped for a TIE fighter and featured shields and a Class 1 hyperdrive, meaning that this ship could also be used for long-range reconnaissance. Unfortunately for the Empire, the Rebellion immediately knew what they were looking at and tried very hard to destroy the Phantom's supply chain and also manufacturing depots. When people think about the first Star Destroyer, they usually think about the Venator-class Star Destroyer, heavily utilized by the Galactic Republic Navy during the Clone Wars. But to me, the Venator was designed more as a carrier rather than a ship of the line. And that's because it lacked firepower for a ship of its size, and at the same time it had an enormous and very well-designed starship hangar, which is where most of the Venator's offensive and defensive power comes from. And so in my opinion, the first true Star Destroyer of this modern Galactic Empire period was actually the Victory-class Star Destroyer. Unlike the Venator-class Star Destroyer, which had a massive hangar running along almost the entire length of its structure, the Victory-class Star Destroyer had much more girth midship, like an Imperial-class Star Destroyer. It was only 900 meters long, much shorter than a Venator-class, but it was armed to the teeth with 10 quad turbolasers and 40 double turbolaser batteries, and it had just 2 squadrons of starfighters stationed on board. And so this was really a proper battleship that was designed to exchange and take enemy broadside. The Victory class would leave the shipyard in the last year of the Clone Wars, where it would see limited action against the Techno-Union before the Republic collapses. And so, unfortunately, by the time the Galactic Civil War has entered its latter stages, the Victory-class Star Destroyer was already considered obsolete. Although because of its smaller size and heavy armament, it was a very capable low-orbit bombardment platform, because it required minimal effort for the ship to fly in the upper atmosphere of a planet. The Cantwell class arrestor cruiser was designed for the Imperial Department of Justice for one specific thing: the interdiction of ships in tightly packed shipping lanes. The cruiser was laid out in a cross design and had 3 tractor beams that created an incredible amount of pull. The Cantwell was lightly armed with just a few ion cannons and laser cannons, along with 2 squadrons of starfighters and a few shuttles for the onboard stormtroopers to use for boarding missions. This ship represented a period of time in the early Empire where they were, I guess, really focused on justice. The idea was to bring in bandits and pirates in alive for trial. Now, this was also an effort to increase the public opinion of the Imperial Navy. Seeing that this is the Galactic Empire, there will be a lot of Star Destroyers on this list, and not all of them are going to be wedge-shaped. As a matter of fact, we tried to look for ones that specifically weren't wedge-shaped. Like the Gladiator class Star Destroyer, this was one of the smaller Star Destroyers at only 600 meters in length. It had a medium amount of armament on board, including 12 dual light turbo lasers, and could carry around 2 squadrons of starfighters as well. These starfighters could be launched and recovered out of the main hangar door between the forked bow of the ship and through small hangar doors to the side. The Gladiator class was equipped with the Class 1 hyperdrive, which meant it was really quick getting from one system to another. And so the ship was mainly used by the Imperial Navy as a patrol vessel in extremely dangerous areas where contact with either rebels or pirates were guaranteed. These ships were really key in giving the Empire the upper hand in the Outer Rim. And that was because this class of ship was faster and required much less resources than an Imperial-class Star Destroyer, but was not easy to destroy by Rebel snubfighters like a Gazanti-class cruiser or even an Architans-class light cruiser. Next up in our silly lineup of non-triangular Star Destroyers is the Onager class Star Destroyer, which honestly just looks like a larger version of Chewie's bowcaster. Nicknamed the Imperial Siegebreaker by the Rebel Alliance, this ship was essentially a siege weapon used to eradicate fortified worlds or just entire planets if necessary. Post-Battle of Endor, with the Empire reeling in chaos and fear, the Onager class Star Destroyer represented the ultimate revenge weapon. At the ship's core was a massive kyber crystal powered weapon which could destroy any rebel ship in basically one shot. The main weapon was also capable of blasting its way through planetary shields, which were oftentimes robust enough to withstand the firepower of an entire fleet of Imperial-class Star Destroyers. Now, the Onager had 2 options when it came to its main weapon, and both of these options were powered by a kyber crystal. First, you have the Orbital Bombardment Particle Cannon, which essentially fires large blobs of superheated plasma. Then you had the Super Heavy Composite Beam Turbo Laser, which was an overpowered turbo laser that fired a beam of energy. Both weapons were considered amongst the most powerful in the entire Imperial arsenal. Ultimately, this ship was a much better alternative to the Death Star. Rebel intelligence estimated that the Galactic Empire could build thousands of Onager-class Star Destroyers for the price of one single battle station. The Onager-class Star Destroyer was a relatively weak ship defensively and required an entire escort fleet guarding it. It had relatively strong deflector shields, but these were all concentrated towards the front of the ship. The flanks and engine area on the Onager were essentially unguarded and relatively easy to damage. It was rumored that the First Order Manator 4 class siege Dreadnought was inspired by this Imperial design. The Gazanti-class cruiser was a pretty versatile platform that could serve as a transport for large vehicles like the AT-AT, but the Y-85 Titan dropship was purpose-built for this role. The large box-shaped ship could actually carry 4 AT-ATs or 4 AT-STs internally. This allowed for quick and hot drops into combat zones all the way from orbit, something that the Gazanti-class cruiser, which carried walkers on exterior hardpoints, could not. The only problem was that the Y-85 Titan's dropship was not hyperdrive equipped and honestly quite slow at even sublight speeds, and so it really depended on larger ships to carry them into battle. But because of the large size of the Y-85 Titan, only something like the 19-kilometer long Executor-class Star Dreadnought could carry it in hyperspace. A regular Imperial-class Star Destroyer's hangar was actually too small to fit a Y-85, and so most Imperial battle groups relied on the Gazanti-class cruiser instead. The heart of the Imperial Navy was its ships of the line. The Navy was all about giant battleships and banks of turbo lasers. Less attention was paid to the Starfighter Corps, which was mostly made up of lightly armed short-range interceptors, which was a shame because the Empire developed one of the most complete and robust pipelines for training Imperial Starfighter pilots. Now, most Imperial ships on the line only had enough hangar space for maybe a few dozen starfighters, and most of these starfighters were used as like a defensive screen against enemy starfighters. That or a dedicated carrier like the Quasar Fire class cruiser carrier would be used as a support ship, but these were still relatively small carrier ships with only a few squadrons of starships on board. The Sector class Star Destroyer in many ways is like the true successor of the Manator class Star Destroyer from the Republic era. It was lightly armed for a ship that was over 2.2 kilometers long. It only had 15 heavy turbolasers and 15 light turbolasers. But on board in its two ventral hangar bays, the Sector class Star Destroyer could hold up to 144 starfighters, along with multiple other crafts like shuttles and gunships. The Sector class Star Destroyer also had dual command towers. One served as the bridge for the ship, and the other one served as an air traffic control tower. When it came to size, there were very few starships that could compete with the Super Star Destroyer class. And while most of you know about the Executor class Star Dreadnought, you might not have heard of the Eclipse class Dreadnought. The ship was about 1,000 meters shorter than the Executor class, but it had a massive front keel which was shaped almost like a gigantic blade, which is exactly what the Eclipse was designed for. You see, the ship would just fly right through enemy naval formations and then cut right through the command ship, usually destroying it by ramming it. If that weren't scary enough, the Dreadnought also had a miniaturized Death Star super laser that ran across the entire length of the ship. So the ramming wasn't even all that necessary. This was all about crushing your enemies, seeing them being driven before you, and then hearing the lamentations of their women. The Carrack-class light cruiser came from the Republic era. At 350 meters long, it was one of the smaller ships fielded by the Empire and actually considered a gunship by the Imperial Navy. It was a relatively fast ship for its size and could even keep up with an X-Wing in a straight line. What makes the Carrack class a light cruiser and extremely dangerous was its 10 heavy turbo laser turrets and 20 laser cannons. Combine that with its fast speed and maneuverability, and you had an incredibly dangerous ship that could destroy your average Rebel capital ship with relative ease. The only weakness with the Carrack-class light cruiser was that it lacked an internal hangar for starfighters and had to rely on external hardpoint. The Raider II class corvette was even smaller than the Carrack-class light cruiser. At only 150 meters in length, this small ship was more about stealth and transportation. It was mainly used by Special Forces teams as a command center and was well equipped for survival and escaping larger enemy fleets. While it had no turbo lasers on board, it did have concussion missiles, point defense lasers, and ion cannons. Lastly, we have a very strange looking Dreadnought. We're not exactly sure if it existed or not, but Rebel Alliance Intelligence Service wrote a report about this Imperial ship that was disguised as a space rock for some reason. Perhaps this was an early attempt by the Empire to build ships from asteroids by adding engines to them, which is exactly how the First Order ended up building Star Killer Base. In Star Wars, it seems like the interceptors and multi-purpose starfighters get all of the flash and glory, whereas fighter-bomber designs are more or less forgotten and uninspired. I mean, the TIE Bomber is just the TIE fighter with an added compartment for bombs. The Y-Wing was used by 3 generations of good guy factions with very few changes and updates, and any alternative the Rebels had were ridiculous, like the B-Wing. Well, after the success of the Y-Wing, Kongstar Manufacturing tried to basically capitalize on the design's popularity by designing other assault fighter bombers. This is where we get the BTS-A2 long-range strike fighter bomber, otherwise known as the H-Wing. Because like the Mal Cloud Car, there are 2 cockpits on this design. One cockpit was for the pilot and one cockpit was for the gunner and weapons officer. Now, there was one huge design flaw with the H-Wing, and that is the controls in the cockpits were not redundant. And so if you lost the pilot cockpit, you no longer could steer the ship, or if you lost the weapons cockpit, you no longer had weapons. Either way, it was a pretty bad situation when that happened in the middle of a battle. The H-Wing was pretty heavily armed though. It had much more weapons than the Y-Wing, and only the B-Wing had more firepower in the Rebel Alliance Starfighter Corps. Now, the H-Wing was also a bit slower than the Y-Wing, but luckily it had much thicker armor and very heavy deflector shields. There are many in the Rebel High Command who believe that the H-Wing should have replaced the less than reliable B-Wing, which is also really awkward to fly. But ultimately, it came down to cost and manpower. The H-Wing required a crew of 3 and is twice as expensive as most single-seater fighters like the Y-Wing. Sorosub Corporation was the pride of the Sullustan species. With the rise of the Empire, Sorosub remained loyal to the new government in order to protect their holdings. But eventually, as the Galactic Civil War kicked into a higher gear with the Battle of Yavin, Sorosub would defect after Sullustan rebel hero Nia Nub staged a hostile corporate takeover of the company. Now, Sorosub at this point in time was a pretty well-diversified company, but it mainly relied on mining and heavy industry. During the Galactic Republic period, Sorosub developed their own starfighter to protect their local business interests, the Cutlass 9 Patrol Fighter. This was a 12-meter-long hyperdrive-equipped short-range interceptor. Sorosub would supply the CIS during the Clone Wars, and also a few of these ships would make it into the hands of the Jedi Starfighter Corps as well. Jedi Master Pilot Sassy Tin was known to fly such a ship. It should be noted that even before Sorosub officially defected to the Rebel Alliance, they were covertly supplying these type of patrol craft already to the Rebel Alliance. You guys probably know that I'm not a huge fan of the B-Wing design, but I do kind of like the H60 Tempest, which is considered kind of the precursor to the B-Wing. The H60 Tempest Bomber was created by Slane and Corporal, a Verpine starfighter manufacturer who was also responsible for the V19 Torrent Starfighter. The H60 Bomber was shaped like a single wing, and it had 2 detachable cockpits on either side, one for the pilot and one for the gunner. Now, originally, the Verpine tried to sell the H60 alongside the V19 Torrent Starfighter to the Galactic Republic, but the Republic would reject the H60 design because it was kind of confusing for its non-insect clone trooper pilots. So, unfortunately, Slane and Corporal would not find any prospective buyers for their H60 Tempest Bomber, and the ship basically sat in the scrapyards. Until 15 years later, when the genius Mon Calamari engineer known as Corey drew inspiration from the H60's design along with the V19 Torrent Starfighter and came up with the Blade Wing prototype, which of course would eventually become the B-Wing. Also, much earlier, around the time of the Battle of Yavin, the Rebel Alliance was already using refurbished H60 Tempest Bombers, which were actually the original ones first designed by Slane and Corporal. Built specifically for the Jedi Starfighter Corps, the Delta 7 Aether Sprite Light Interceptor represented the pinnacle in starfighter frame design. This was a highly maneuverable and extremely simple ship design. The Jedi used the Force to help aid their flying, so many of the usual pilot aids you might see in a starfighter like this are actually missing. The Delta 7's hull was so thin and sleek that the astromech socket on the fighter could only fit the head of a standard astromech, which required the pilot to heavily modify their droids in order to bring them along for flights. Now, the Delta 7 Aether Sprite would eventually be replaced by the ETA-2 Actus class interceptor, which was a much more well-rounded starfighter. The Rebel Alliance, however, would acquire some of these mothballed Delta 7s, and they would join the early versions of the Rebel Alliance Starfighter Corps. The R22 Spearhead, also known as the R22 A-Wing, was a state-of-the-art experimental starfighter designed by Quad System Engineering towards the end of the Republic era. It was actually designed as one of the potential replacements for the Delta 7 Aether Sprite we were just talking about. The R22's small wedge-like frame was extremely durable and light and allowed for record-breaking speed and maneuverability, but was considered too expensive and unnecessarily high performance by the Galactic Empire for mass production for their own navy. And so the majority of the R22 prototypes would actually fall into the hands of the Tammuz-An Planetary Defense Force. The Rebel Alliance eventually got their hands on these R22 prototypes and found it highly customizable. They switched out the engines and installed new shielding and weapons and created the beloved RZ-1 A-Wing. Still, the original R22 would see some combat in action in the Rebel Alliance fleet. Although Poe Dameron once remarked that the original R22s were almost like stunt flyers because of their extreme maneuverability and lack of flight aids and normal military equipment. The Rebellion also created a variant of the RZ-1 known as the RZ-1T, or the RZ-1 A-Wing trainer. The only difference it had from the standard A-Wing was an additional seat for an instructor in the back of the already really cramped cockpit. Whereas the X-Wing was relatively easy to fly, especially for those with experience in the INCOM line of starfighters, the A-Wing was a death trap for inexperienced and lesser skilled pilots. Its legendary speed and maneuverability meant that only the pilots with the fastest reaction time and most skilled could actually safely fly this ship without getting themselves hurt. So the RZ-1 trainer was a great way to kind of ease new pilots into this platform. The Rebellion heavily relied on snub fighters to project its fleet's power and capability. This also meant that they needed a decent reconnaissance starfighter to scout out new locations and systems where they can base their operation at. While the Rebellion was known to run some Clone Wars era INCOM ARC-170 recon birds, the T65br X-Wing reconnaissance bird was actually purpose-built to do this, and it was a lot newer and a lot cheaper to operate than the ARC-170s. The T65br is basically a normal X-Wing with an advanced high-gain long-range sensor package and high-speed communication receivers where the proton torpedoes usually sat. The X-Wing could also drop probes and had an advanced imaging system placed onto its nose, which is probably one of the more recognizable features on this X-Wing. These recon birds also heavily relied on a R2R series astromech to help coordinate all of the communication and onboard sensor data. The X4 gunship was built by INCOM Corporation, and it was supposed to fill a need for a heavy-hitting assault gunboat in the Rebel Alliance fleet. The X4 had a crew of 8 and was armed with 8 laser turrets, but surprisingly lacked other heavy weapons. And so it was mostly relegated to escort convoys and protect them from enemy starfighters, a job that it was actually pretty well designed to do. The ship's maneuverability and abundance of point defense weapons made it essentially a flying TIE fighter killing machine. The R22 Starfighter is a badass looking ship. It kind of reminds me of a Corvette Stingray or something like that. It's classified as a heavy fighter and was most famously used by General Grievous during the Clone Wars. In my opinion, this was essentially a muscle car pretending to be a starfighter. Its sublight engines were quite large and heavy for a starship of its size and quite inefficient. The R22 also had an abysmal Class 6 hyperdrive. I don't even know why you would bother installing a hyperdrive that slow onto a ship like this. The Belbalab lacked heavy weapons, but it did have 2 triple light laser cannons, making it quite deadly to enemy starfighters at close range. At the same time, the starfighter had an incredibly tough armor on par with a small gunboat. This was paired with a very powerful shield, which allowed the Belbalab to survive even the heaviest of enemy fire. The Rebel Alliance would actually get their hands on several Belbalab-22 heavy starfighters, and they would be used as elite fighters for the Starfighter Corps. Horst and Kessel Drive was a lesser-known starship manufacturing company that was actually quite popular amongst the Corpo states in the Confederacy of Independent Systems. Their work includes the Lucra hull class of freighters and also the Munificent class star frigates. They also attempted to break into the starfighter market with the R41 Star Chaser. It was supposed to compete with the Z95 Headhunter, a very solid INCOM product from before the Clone Wars. This multi-role starfighter had a very flimsy airframe and it lacked good armor, but it was quite maneuverable, had good weapons and speed. The ship also had ion cannons, which allowed it to disable enemy ships' electronic systems. The R41 would only really be used by the Alliance to restore the Republic in the very early days of the war. Once the X-Wing was available, the R41s were essentially phased out. Horst Kessel Drive would follow up the R41 design with the R60 T-Wing Interceptor. This was originally designed to replace the A-Wing Interceptor, but the T-Wing would widely be considered a failure. While it had a decent amount of speed on par with a TIE Interceptor and not quite as fast as an A-Wing, its maneuverability is where all the problems came in. It just was not able to outturn other ships in a dogfight. The Rebel Alliance would only use the T-Wing for a pretty short period of time before trying to sell them to local planetary defense forces. They just weren't able to perform at the level they wanted to. The CR-90 is a pretty famous ship in Star Wars, but what about the CR-70? This was essentially the precursor to the CR-90. It was about the same size and less heavily armored and armed. This was the ship used by Bail Organa during Order 66 to hold important meetings with Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda. The CR-70 would transition from being the standard Alderaanian diplomatic vessel to becoming basically the main capital ship for the fledgling alliance to restore the Republic. Although the real reason why the CR-70 was created was because diehard fans like you noticed that the Tantive 4 at the end of Revenge of the Sith looked different from what it looked like in A New Hope, and so they retconned everything, creating the CR-70, and called the ship we see at the end of Episode 3 the Tantive 3 instead. Tantive 3, Tantive 4, does it really matter? Well, the CR-70 is basically an earlier model of the CR-90. The Pelticlans frigate from Quat Drive Yards was another Clone Wars holdover, which had survived the test of time because of its highly modular design. This thing was essentially the sprinter van of the Star Wars galaxy. During the Clone Wars, this ship was used mainly as a medical frigate or escort vessel. It was also used by civilian agencies to deliver food and aid to war-torn worlds. At 282 meters long, the Pelticlan frigate was much larger than any of the early Alderaanian ships fielded by the Alliance to restore the Republic, and so the Pelta would not only serve as a hospital ship, but also as a command ship. The Phoenix Home, for instance, was the command ship of Phoenix Squadron. The DP-20 frigate, also known as the Corellian Gunship, is a product of Corellian Engineering Corporation. It looks extremely similar to the CR-90 Corvette, and that's because of its real-life production design history. You see, the DP-20 essentially is a recycled concept art of the original Millennium Falcon. George Lucas wanted the Millennium Falcon to be a fast ship, hence the famous blockade runner configuration of the massive engines in the back. The DP-20 design would then be converted into the famous CR-90 Corvette Tantive 4. The DP-20 design would then be converted into the famous CR-90 Corvette Tantive 4 when the actual Millennium Falcon design was finalized. The DP-20 was similar to the CR-90 in many different ways, especially in its shape and configuration of how each one of the modules on the ship sat. The only really major difference is the front cockpit area. On the DP-20, it kind of looks like a space capsule. The DP-20 in-universe was originally designed for naval action during the Clone Wars. The Galactic Republic had envisioned it as a fast and heavily armed gunship. Now, half of this Corellian gunship was essentially its engines, and despite being 30 meters shorter than a CR-90, the DP-20 actually had double the firepower and double the turbo lasers. The DP-20 would wreak havoc against enemy TIE fighter squadrons and even posed a danger to larger Imperial ships. When one talks about Mon Cala ships in Star Wars, I usually think about the large cruisers, either the MC-75s or the MC-80s. But the Mon Calamari also had smaller variants of their large bulbous cruisers, like the MC-30C frigate. These were high-speed attack frigates, which were capable of doing tons of damage within a short time. This was thanks to the heavy armament of 16 turbolasers and 16 twin medium laser cannons found on board. Unlike larger Mon Cala ships, though, the MC-30C lacked the same type of redundant shield system and relied more on speed for defense. Just like the rest of the Mon Calamari fleet, the MC-30C frigate was repurposed from underwater civic buildings. One step up from the MC-30C frigate was the MC-40A light cruiser. The ship still featured the classic Mon Cala cruiser clamshell design, but the ship had below average speed and, like the larger Mon Calamari cruisers, had an extremely heavy deflector shield system. The light cruiser was also heavily armed with an assortment of ion cannons and turbo lasers, but what really made the MC-40A special was its 6 tractor beams. The light cruiser would actually use its tractor beam to latch onto the back of a Star Destroyer, which is of course the weakest area and least defended area on a Star Destroyer. And when that Star Destroyer tries to move around, well, the light cruiser would move around with it and continuously hammer that one position. It's actually a really ingenious strategy. With the Confederacy of Invent Systems basically decommissioning their entire fleet within a week, it's not surprising that the Rebellion would eventually get their hands on some of their former ships. The Lucra Hull-class battleship was a reconfigured super freighter which was used as a command ship and carrier during the Clone Wars. General Hera Syndulla would acquire one of these ships and outfit it as a training center for new Rebel pilots. It was kind of perfect for the job. It was more than large enough to hold an entire school inside of it, along with a support staff. But at the same time, it was mobile and could travel from one system to another if trouble came. When the Aftermath novel series was released about the later years of the Galactic Civil War, the Mark I Starhawk was probably one of the more interesting ships introduced by the author. This was supposedly the Rebel Alliance's first attempt at creating a capital ship. The Mon Cala cruisers had performed well, but now the New Republic needed its own mainline battleship in order to go up against the remaining Imperial forces left in the galaxy. The Starhawk-class battleship was supposedly built from parts of incomplete Star Destroyers. Towards the end of the war, the Rebellion had gained access to many Imperial shipyards and storage facilities. The first Starhawk was produced at the Nadiri dockyards. Anyone who's played the Star Wars Squadrons campaign will be familiar with the storyline. At 2,400 meters in length, the Mark I Starhawk was larger than an Imperial-class Star Destroyer and almost as heavily armed. But what made the ship really special was its massive tractor beam. During the Battle of Jakku, the Super Star Destroyer Ravager, a 19-kilometer-long ship, was pulled into the planet's atmosphere by a Starhawk. During the Ruusan Reformation period, when the galactic military was essentially disbanded, Randelli Star Drive produced one of the few capital ships available in the galaxy. It was known as the Dreadnought-class heavy cruiser. It was quite an antiquated ship by the time the Galactic Civil War had started, and required a large amount of crew and lacked automated systems one might expect on a more modern ship. The Rebel Alliance, however, were not deterred by the antiquated Dreadnought. After all, it had enough room inside of it to carry an entire squadron of starfighters, which of course for the Rebel Alliance was very important. The Empire would also use some of these surplus dreadnoughts in the Outer Rim. Grand Admiral Thrawn's 7th Fleet would use the ship for support of their heavier destroyers during the Lothal campaign. The Rebels would further modify the Dreadnought-class heavy cruiser and create the assault frigate Mk2. The modification greatly increased the speed and maneuverability of the Dreadnought while decreasing the amount of crew needed to operate the ship by replacing it with automation and droids. Equipped with 15 medium turbolaser batteries, 10 heavy quad turbolaser cannons, and 20 heavy laser cannons, 2 of these frigates could actually go up against an Imperial-class Star Destroyer and come out victorious. The Braha Tuk class gunship was manufactured by the Dorian Braha Ket Fleetworks conglomerate. Dorian species used this ship to protect their homeworld against the Empire and would later gift these ships to the Rebel Alliance. At 90 meters in length, the Braha Tuk class gunship was smaller than the DP-20, but no less heavily armed. It had 8 concussion missile launchers, 8 double turbolasers, and it could carry up to 2 starfighters. Its one weakness is that it only had a Class 3 hyperdrive, which was a bit lower than the standard in the galaxy at the time, which was a Class 2 hyperdrive. But it did have very potent sublight engines, and it was quite maneuverable. One of the most famous Braha Tuk class gunships was the Pelianis Promise. It served as the main escort for the CR-90 Corvette Thunderstrike, which carried the 61st Mobile Infantry, aka Twilight Company, during the mid-run campaigns of the Galactic Civil War. Described as a small dagger of a ship, the Pelianis Promise did its best to protect the Thunderstrike all throughout the campaign. It even once went up against a Star Destroyer, which was 20 times its size, and survived. Sometimes it's a good idea to bring a knife to a turbolaser fight. So there you have it, guys, 10 lesser-known Rebel Alliance ships that served in the Galactic Civil War. Let me know in the comment section below if I've missed any other important Rebel ships that deserve to be on this list. Also, let me know what you guys want to see next. Should we do the lesser-known ships of the Galactic Republic, or maybe the Empire, or should we do like the lesser-known starfighters of the Rebel Alliance? Let me know in the comment section below. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button. And as usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech. Now, you guys know all about the Separatist Alliance's main starfighter, the Vulture droid. It is featured in many of the films and TV shows, and it plays a big role in the CIS Navy. But have you guys ever heard of the Scarab Starfighter, its predecessor? The Scarab Starfighter had far less moving pieces. It couldn't walk around in patrol mode like the Vulture droid could. This also meant that the Scarab class lacked the same type of maneuverability you would get from a Vulture class droid or one of the droid tri-fighters. The Scarab did, however, make up for it by having a decent amount of armor and heavy deflector shields, which increased its survivability. More importantly, the Scarab-class droid fighter could actually operate independent from some type of control system, which meant that the Scarab-class droid fighter could keep fighting even if a Separatist control ship was destroyed. The Scarab Starfighter would be tested by the Trade Federation during the invasion of Naboo in 32 BBY. A battle that ultimately ended up with the Trade Federation defeated because of its reliance on a centralized control ship. If only they had less Vulture droids at the time and more Scarab Starfighters, they probably could have changed the course of history, which actually might be a good video idea. Despite the fact that most Trade Federation executives preferred the Vulture-class Starfighter, the Scarab-class Starfighter was still in use by the Confederacy during the Clone Wars. Because the Separatist Alliance was a relatively new confederation, its central military system still relied on planetary and local defense systems of its member states. While you had standardized ships and droids used by the CIS Navy, when Confederate forces were defending a system, they usually also relied on local militias for aid. The Nantex-class territorial defense starfighter was developed by Hoopla Pasa Tisk Shipwrights Collective and used by the Geonosians to protect their homeworld. The Geonosians were quite a strange and unique race, and their starfighter design was no different. The Nantex class was a relatively small ship at 9 meters in length. It lacked a hyperdrive, but it had a shield system. The ship had a small profile and was quite nimble. It was capable in both space and in atmosphere. The ship's large bubble cockpit gave the pilot almost a 360-degree field of view of their surroundings, which is terrific in a dogfight. The ship also utilized 100 small tractor beams to latch onto enemy fighters and essentially point their weapons at the right direction. A very interesting and unorthodox way to aim your starship. And judging by how much the Galactic Republic struggled with these fighters, the Nantex's more unorthodox design choices seem to be working very well. When we look at ships like the Z95 Headhunter or the ARC-170 Starfighter, we oftentimes think about Incom Corporation, one of the most beloved and important starfighter manufacturers in galactic history. But without the help of another company known as Sublight Products Corporation, most of Incom's early designs would have never happened. Prior to the production of the Z95, one of the best-selling ships in galactic history, Incom was just a repulsor lift manufacturer. They did projects that were important and massive like Bespin's Cloud City, but they just weren't starfighter manufacturers. And so it was really Sublight Products, or SubPro, who brought all of the know-how about how to design and engineer a starfighter. And even though SubPro did their fair share of engineering and design on their collaborative works with Incom, they never truly received the same recognition and financial reward. Some might say it's because SubPro is located in the Outer Rim, and more importantly, it's ran by Trandoshans, which definitely cheapens its name and brand. The Nova Sword Space Superiority Starfighter was supposed to change all of this. This ship was supposed to build on the success of the Z95 Headhunter and improve it in every single way. And Sublight Products Corporations would be the sole designer and manufacturer of this model. What you ended up having was a well-balanced ship with good shielding, good maneuverability, and also a hyperdrive. It could do anything from being a scout to an interceptor or even assault vessel, thanks to the concussion missile launchers on board. Unfortunately, it was still made by Trandoshan, so I guess no one bought it. The starship industry in Star Wars shares a lot of similarities with the automobile industry here on Earth. When you have a new brand, you start your first few products and try to make them as high-performing and luxurious as possible in order to establish a very high-value brand, like what Tesla did with the Tesla S. And then once you've wowed your potential consumers, you start rolling out the cheaper and more standard models for the masses, aka the Tesla Model 3. Republic Senior Systems, which would one day become Senior Fleet Systems, one of the most prolific shipbuilders in the entire galaxy, followed a similar business strategy. Before Senior Fleet Systems landed that massive Imperial contract to basically supply every starfighter in the Imperial Navy, Senior Fleet Systems was a relatively small and boutique starship designer. They focused on very innovative and forward-thinking designs. One of their ships was the Star Courier, which was a small transport ship that exemplified what Republic Senior Fleet Systems stood for at the time. This was a limited production ship that was usually bought by very wealthy and influential businessmen or politicians from all across the galaxy who needed safe transport through very dangerous areas. These ships could be heavily modified, as was the case with the Scimitar. This was a special transport made specifically for Sith Lord Darth Maul. It featured a Class 1.5 hyperdrive robust shields and had many countermeasures that made scanning and locking onto the ship's signature very difficult. The ship even had a Stegium crystal-powered cloaking device, which made it essentially invisible. The Scimitar, like most Star Courier variants, lacked heavy weapons and only had 6 solar ionization cannons. These ships relied much more on stealth and speed for survival. The Rogue-class Porax 38 Starfighter, or the P-38, was manufactured by Bactoid Armor Workshop. Now, this kind of looks like the Scarab-class droid fighter we just talked about, but this ship actually does have an independent cockpit for a pilot, and it also has a life support system for organics as well. It was, however, mainly used by General Grievous or Asajj Ventress's IG-99 Magna Guard droids during the Clone Wars. These ships were relatively small but packed a punch with their 2 heavy laser cannons, which cycled at a very slow firing rate but could cut right through the shields of most starfighters with just one shot. Bounty Hunter Cad Bane would own a specially modified Rogue-class starfighter, which even had a cloaking device built into it. The Gx-class Starfighter was another Geonosian design specifically made for the Sith assassin Asajj Ventress. Only 6 of these ships were built for Asajj Ventress specifically, and so if you ever run into one on a scrap world, I highly recommend you secure it for yourself. The Gx, or Fan Blade Starfighter, is easy to spot because of its large solar sail, which not only gave the ship more sublight speed, it also served as a shield. The Fan Blade, however, did give off a lot of energy and had a huge signature on most sensors. It was not a very stealthy ship. Still, thanks to its strange design, the Fan Blade was amongst the fastest and most maneuverable ships on the battlefield, and its dual laser cannons were more than enough to destroy even the most capable starfighters. The Umbarans came from a very dark world hidden inside of a nebula. They would evolve their own technology, language, and culture separate from the rest of the galaxy. It's not surprising that many of their main vehicles and weapons also functioned in very strange ways that was different from the rest of the galaxy. When the Umbarans joined the Clone Wars on the side of the Confederacy, they also brought with them the full power of the Umbaran militia, including the Umbaran Starfighter. The most noticeable feature on the ship right away is the fact that its cockpit was not a physical structure. Instead, it was just a ray shield that had to be powered on. On top of that, the pilot used holographic interfaces to control the ship rather than joysticks and other mechanical inputs. These starfighters were equipped with missile pods and plasma cannons, and despite their strange design, were relatively easy to fly for the average individual, even without training. Amongst the Confederacy of Independent System's various member states was Valahari. This planet was known for having some of the best starfighter engineers and starfighter aces in the galaxy. This relatively small outer rim planet naturally became a part of the massive political game of tug-of-war being played by the Republic and Confederacy during the Clone Wars. Valahari wanted to stay neutral in the war, but sell its excellent starfighters to the Separatists. The Jedi attempted to intervene and even threatened to destroy any ships that were exported to the CIS Navy from Valahari. This resulted in a breakdown of relationships between the Valahari and the Jedi, and consequently, their best advanced starfighter design, the Tempest Zero, would be flown by native Valahari on behalf of the CIS Navy. The Tempest Zero starfighters were heavily armed with 4 forward-facing laser cannons and an additional backwards-facing laser cannon, along with a missile launcher. It also had a harpoon gun, which might seem impractical in space, but actually had its uses. Yeah, I don't know if I buy that. But either way, these Tempest Zeros and their pilots gave the Republic a huge headache in the Outer Rim. The Confederacy of Independent Systems was a loose coalition of Outer Rim planets and interests. While some propaganda painted the CIS as a bunch of wholesome moisture farmers, spice miners, and homesteaders fighting for planetary rights, the real backers of the CIS were the various corpo nations that took over the Outer Rim during the Free Trade Zone era. They essentially established miniature fiefdoms and kingdoms which heavily exploited the natural resources and labor forces of these regions. These corporations would get rich very quickly by providing cheap goods to the core world's hungry consumers. And while some of these corpo states were actually involved in the galaxy's military-industrial complex, the Separatist Navy was still mostly made up of converted industrial ships and freighters, because hey, it's cheaper. The Lucra Hulk battleship, for instance, was actually just a massive container ship used by the Trade Federation to bring goods from the Outer Rim to the core. And that wasn't the only example of giant freighter ships being repurposed as warships within the CIS Navy. Something that took a very similar role to the Lucra Hulk was the DH Omni support vessel built by Horst and Kessel Drive Inc. This spherical-shaped ship was 1.2 kilometers wide and 900 meters long. It was primarily used as a corporate transport vessel before the war, and during the Clone Wars, it would carry multiple C-9979 landing craft, which in turn carried an army of battle droids, tanks, and other supporting vehicles planetside. The only defense on the DH Omni support vessel were point defense laser cannons and any droid fighters stationed on board. During the Battle of Umbara, a few clones inspired by Anakin Skywalker's takedown of the droid control ship during the blockade of Naboo pulled their own stunt. Using stolen and borrowed fighters, they managed to fly inside a DH Omni support vessel and destroy it from within. The Trident-class assault ship is one of the more terrifying Separatist Navy designs. At 88 meters long, this ship was shaped like a squid and was manufactured by Colicoid Creation Ness. They were designers of other terrifying things like the Drutch-class boarding ship, the Buzz Droids, and the feared Droideka. The Trident-class assault ship would fly in space, but it was more at home underwater as an assault vehicle. This ship had large tentacles which had magnetic grapples on it, which allowed it to latch onto surfaces and rip apart enemy structures. The Trident also had 8 laser cannons and a drill which could be used to get through fortifications or the hull of a ship. On board the Trident-class assault ship was usually a squad of Aqua series battle droids trained specifically for underwater boarding operation. Not only did the CIS have a huge population disadvantage to the Republic, they also lacked military leaders. And so the CIS would also become one of the largest employers of mercenary captains and warriors from disgruntled anti-Republic factions. Kavik Toth was the head of a mercenary force known as the Sabbath Squadron. He and his men pledged allegiance to Count Dooku. At the center of his fleet was the Sabbath Destroyer. These were several 100-meter-long capital ships armed with multiple turbo lasers and anti-capital ship batteries, along with several point defense laser cannons. The Sabbath Destroyer also carried a complement of 12 starfighters on board. These destroyers were a huge challenge for Republic forces during the Battle of Geonosis, and that was because they lacked any capital ships of their own. They only had Jedi Starfighters and the Acclamator-class assault ship with them. The world of Mon Cala wasn't just home to one shipbuilding species. The deep-sea Corans were also well known for their warship designs. The Free DAC Volunteer Engineering Corps was responsible for producing the powerful Providence-class Dreadnought and Subjugator-class heavy cruiser. Both of these ships created many problems for the Republic, and unlike the Confederacy's other capital ships, these ships were purpose-built for warfare. Free DAC Volunteer Engineering also made the Recusant-class light destroyer. This 1.2 kilometer long destroyer was originally commissioned for the Commerce Guild. It was heavily armed and designed to take on enemy capital ships in close-range gunfights. Because the Separatist Navy mostly utilized automated crews with very few organic individuals on board, this meant that most of their ships appeared more skeletal in nature because less living space and walkways were needed on board. And so ships like the Recusant-class destroyer had very few vital spots which could be easily protected during battle. As a matter of fact, some Recusant-class light destroyers were even commanded by a droid brain, and no organics could be found on board. Now, these type of ships were known to be quite stubborn in combat and occasionally disobeyed orders in order to pursue the destruction of old targets. The Techno Union was one of the leading heavy industry manufacturing companies in the galaxy. Through their subsidies, they produced the lion's share of the Separatist droid army, including their tanks and supporting vehicles. The Techno Union, however, was not known for building large ships. They would usually contract that out to different shipyards. But one large warship that the Techno Union did create was the kilometer-long Bulwark Mark I battleship. While the ship was armed with an assortment of ion cannons, turbo lasers, and your other usual weapon emplacements, it was really the armor and fortified hull that made this ship special. In close melees, the Bulwark Mark I could actually crash and ram right through enemy ships with minimal damage to its own hull. Towards the end of the war, the Bulwark Mark II was created, which was many times larger than the Mark I variant. The Hardcell-class interstellar transport might look like an old-fashioned lunar lander on steroids, but it was actually considered quite a luxurious ship amongst Techno Union and Intergalactic Banking Clan execs. Those who owned this 220-meter-long ship considered it a status symbol. The transport was lightly equipped with a few laser cannons. It also had exposed fuel tanks lining the outside of the ship, which made a very obvious target for enemy fighters. The hard shell was definitely not designed for combat, and generally when it encountered combat, it would just try to run away. Out of the 286 hard shell class transports located on Geonosis during the first battle of the Clone Wars, only 169 managed to escape the Republic's onslaught. Sometimes the hard shell transports were used also as a platform to store and launch the IG-227 Hailfire class droid tank. It could hold up to 100 of these vehicles in its hangar. Not much information is really known about the Fantail class destroyer, but in my opinion it clearly pays homage to the Starfleet with its ventrally mounted engine. These ships were apparently used by the Corporate Alliance during the Clone Wars. They were also used by Admiral Trench during the Battle of Malstar Narrows prior to the Clone Wars. Admiral Wolf Yularen was in command of Republic forces on the other side of the battle. This is where he first gained respect for the harsh military commander. The YV-865 Aurora class freighter from Corellian Engineering Corporation made it onto our ugliest ship list, not only for aesthetic reasons, but because this ship was mainly used by the Zygerian slave empire as a slave ship. But this freighter was also used by the Mining Guild along with Banking Clan and other factions of the CIS who needed a smaller size freighter with a decent amount of cargo space. The ship was relatively robust like most Corellian designs, but featured just 2 medium laser cannons and a grappling turret for latching onto minerals. The Captor-class heavy munitions cruiser was designed by Quad Drive Yards for the Trade Federation. They mainly used the ship to basically store and transport very valuable things. During the Stark Hyperspace War, these heavily armored and armed cruisers were used to transport valuable life-saving Bacta to the core regions. These ships had a large hangar space located in the center of the ship, which was either equipped with a wing of A6 interceptors or Vulture fighters. Like most ships in the CIS Navy, the Captor-class heavy munitions cruiser was also capable of deploying and holding massive amounts of battle droids on board. Lastly, we have the Diamond-class cruiser, which was used by the Commerce Guild. They're kind of hard to see because when they're grounded, they land vertically and their half-disc shape sort of looks like a building more than anything. But they were in the background of a few shots during this battle. The ship was designed to quickly deploy up to 600 OG-9 homing spider droids or 2400 DSD-1 dwarf spider droids, which is actually a lot of stuff for only a 200-meter long ship to hold. But the ship was only armed with 2 laser cannon batteries, which meant that the Diamond-class cruiser avoided combat at all costs. And during the Battle of Geonosis, their main job was to ferry troops off-world.